When did a family's secret surface after your grandfather passed? The day my grandfather died was the day I learned about the beach house, and the day I truly understood how quickly the tide could turn not just on the shore but in a family. For weeks, I'd been wrestling with a quiet dread, a simmering accusation that felt both righteous and profoundly wrong, all while the humid air of Florida clung to me like a second skin. It started, as these things often do, with an email, a formal notice that cut through the mundane clutter of my inbox, announcing a will reading. I remember reading it on my phone, standing by the microwave at work, the hum of the machine a stark contrast to the sudden silence that had fallen over my own world. Granddad had been sick, of course, but his passing still felt abrupt, like a sudden drop in an elevator. My immediate thought wasn't about inheritance, but about my family, how we'd all gather, console each other, reminisce. Oh, how naive I was. Our family, a sprawling, chaotic collection of distant cousins, estranged aunts, and the occasional unknown relative who popped up at funerals, was rarely united. Granddad's passing, though, was different. He was the patriarch, the glue, however fragile, that held us all together. So when the invite came not just for the funeral but for an actual week-long family gathering at his beloved beach house in the Florida Keys, followed by the reading of the will, a collective eyebrow was raised. My grandfather, Arthur Williams, a man of simple pleasures and complex finances, had always been a bit theatrical. This seemed like his final grand performance. Louis Williams, 25M, was among the first to arrive. I'd driven straight through from Atlanta, the miles blurring into a monotonous hum of highway, my mind replaying fragmented memories of Granddad. He'd taught me how to fish off a rickety pier, how to fix a leaky faucet, and perhaps most importantly, how to stand my ground. I considered myself a determined advocate, always ready to fight for what was right, a trait that would soon be tested beyond anything I could have imagined. The beach house itself was less of a house and more of an institution. A sprawling sun-bleached structure with peeling paint and an air of comfortable dilapidation, it sat directly on the sand, its back porch opening up to an endless expanse of turquoise water. It was a place of endless summers, sticky with salt and sunscreen, echoing with laughter and the occasional shouted argument. As I parked my beat-up sedan, the humid air hit me, thick and sweet with the scent of salt and blooming oleander. The house felt strangely quiet without Granddad, a hollow space waiting to be filled. Soon the others started trickling in. My Aunt Heather Shaw, 64F, Granddad's younger sister, arrived first, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose. Heather was always a bit of an enigma. She ran a successful art gallery up north and had an air of sophisticated detachment, but I'd always found a strange sort of comfort in her quiet observations. People often underestimated her, mistaking her reserved nature for coldness, but I knew she had a sharp mind and a quiet strength. She greeted me with a tight, almost formal hug, her eyes, though hidden behind dark lenses, seeming to assess everything around her. "Louis," she murmured, her voice soft, "it's good to see you. Difficult circumstances, though." She wasn't one for effusive displays of emotion, but I saw the faint tremor in her hand as she adjusted her bag. It was an early sign that even for her, this was more than just a formality. Next came my cousin, Deborah Ivanov, 25F. Deborah was a force of nature, all wild blonde hair and impulsive energy, always chasing the next big thrill or the latest bright idea. She lived life on her own terms, which usually meant flitting from one spontaneous adventure to the next. We'd grown up together, thick as thieves, but as adults our paths had diverged. She worked as a social media influencer, perpetually glued to her phone even now as she bounced out of a rented convertible. "Lou, my man," she shrieked, pulling me into a bone-crushing hug. "Can you believe this? Granddad pulling one last stunt, I mean a whole week here before the will, only him." She laughed, a bright, slightly manic sound, already snapping photos of the beach house for her followers, her enthusiasm almost jarring against the somber backdrop. I knew her impulsiveness often led her into trouble, but I couldn't help but be charmed by her unbridled zest for life, even if it was sometimes misplaced. Later that afternoon, a sleek black SUV pulled up and out stepped Janet Griffin, 28F. Janet was Granddad's grandniece, a distant relative I barely knew. She was a lawyer, precise and analytical, always impeccably dressed even in the casual Florida heat. She held herself with an almost unapproachable air, her dark eyes seeming to take in every detail, every nuance. Our interactions had always been polite but brief, limited to holiday gatherings where she was usually tucked away in a corner with a book. I'd heard whispers about her, a high-achieving career, a sharp wit, but also a reputation for being somewhat aloof. She offered me a curt nod, her expression unreadable. "Louis," she acknowledged, her voice low and even. Ashamed to meet under these circumstances. She seemed almost too composed, a stark contrast to Deborah's exuberance, and I found myself wondering what was really going on behind that calm facade. She carried a slim briefcase, not a typical accessory for a beach vacation, which I found curious. The last to arrive, well after dusk had settled and the first stars had pricked through the inky sky, was Ethan Singh, 54M. Ethan was Granddad's neighbor from up the coast, a man of few words who lived a reclusive life. He was a fisherman, weathered and tanned, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of unspoken stories. Granddad had always spoken highly of him, referring to him as a good man, but the rest of the family largely considered him an oddball, a strange loner who kept to himself. He arrived in an old, beat-up pickup truck, its bed filled with fishing gear, looking utterly out of place in our suddenly crowded family gathering. He barely made eye contact, just grunted a greeting to Heather and me, before heading straight for the smallest, most isolated bedroom at the back of the house, away from the main living area. He seemed less interested in the family drama than in simply finding a quiet corner to disappear into, which only solidified the family's view of him as peculiar and misunderstood. I noticed, though, a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep sadness perhaps that felt more profound than mere awkwardness. The first few days were a strange charade. We'd gather for meals, talking about everything and nothing, carefully skirting the true purpose of our assembly. Deborah was constantly on her phone, creating content, making jokes, trying to lighten the mood. Janet was often in a quiet corner, reading or making notes in a small pad, occasionally interjecting with a sharp, insightful comment that cut through the superficiality. Heather watched us all with a quiet intensity, her wisdom occasionally surfacing in a pithy remark or a gentle redirection of conversation. Ethan remained a phantom, appearing only for meals, eating quickly and then retreating. I tried to engage him once, asking about the local fishing, but he just grunted and said, "It's good," then went back to his plate. He seemed to want no part of our family dynamics. My own emotions were a mess. One moment, I felt a deep ache of grief for Granddad. The next, a growing unease about the upcoming will reading, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. I found myself walking the beach at dawn, the cool sand under my feet, the rhythmic crash of waves, a constant, soothing presence. I knew this house, every creak of its floorboards, every chipped tile in the kitchen. It was more than just property, it was a repository of memories, a symbol of our family's history. On the fourth evening, the air grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension. The sky had turned a bruised purple and the waves, usually gentle, crashed with a new, insistent roar. We were all gathered in the living room, a space filled with Granddad's old, worn furniture and the scent of salt and aged wood. Deborah was scrolling through her phone, occasionally giggling at something online. Janet was subtly polishing her glasses. Heather was looking out at the darkening sea, a thoughtful expression on her face. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Granddad's lawyer, a dry, humorless man named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. He'd flown in that morning, adding another layer of formality to the already strained atmosphere. "As you all know," he began, his voice devoid of emotion, "Arthur's will stipulated that all interested parties be present here for a week before the reading. This was his particular wish." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. Now regarding the primary asset, the beach house, a collective intake of breath, this was it. Everyone leaned forward, even Deborah, who finally put her phone down. Mr. Henderson continued, "Arthur's will states that the beach house and the significant trust fund associated with its upkeep and a generous sum of liquid assets will be left to," he paused for dramatic effect or perhaps just to clear his throat again, "to a single heir contingent upon certain conditions being met." My stomach clenched. A single heir? Granddad had always been fair, almost to a fault. This was completely out of character. "And that heir," Mr. Henderson finally announced, "is not one of you present." A stunned silence fell over the room. Even the roar of the ocean outside seemed to dim. Deborah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Heather remained impassive, but I saw a slight tightening around her lips. Janet, for the first time, looked genuinely surprised, a fleeting flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" Deborah blurted out, her voice high and incredulous. "Who else is there?" "This is his family." Mr. Henderson calmly produced a document from his briefcase. "Arthur, in a codicil added just 6 months ago, named a distant cousin, a Ms. Anya Petrova, as the sole beneficiary of the property and the bulk of his estate. The condition is that she must take full possession and residency within 30 days of the will's reading, otherwise the estate reverts to a charitable trust." Anya Petrova? I'd never even heard that name. A distant cousin, this was insane. My mind reeled, it didn't make any sense. Granddad, who valued family above all else, leaving everything to a complete stranger, bypassing his immediate family, all of us who had spent countless summers here, who had loved him unconditionally. It felt like a betrayal. Deborah was already on her feet, practically sputtering. "Are you serious? A random cousin we've never met? This is ridiculous. He must have been manipulated. He wouldn't do this." Her face was flushed, her usual carefree demeanor replaced by raw fury. Heather finally spoke, her voice remarkably steady. "Mr. Henderson was Arthur of sound mind when he made this amendment." "He was, Ms. Shaw," the lawyer replied, his voice firm. "We had multiple consultations. He was very clear about his intentions." "Clear about his intentions?" I scoffed, unable to keep the anger from my voice. "He was clear about cutting us all out. This makes no sense. He loved this place, he loved us." "Perhaps he had his reasons, Louis," Janet interjected, her voice surprisingly calm amidst the rising tension. She was still processing, I could tell, but her lawyer's brain was already working. "This is highly unusual though, a charitable trust as a fallback, that's a significant detail." Just as the arguments were beginning to escalate, a new sound cut through the room, not the distant rumble of thunder but a deep, resonant hum like a giant tuning fork vibrating in the earth. The floor beneath us shuddered and then the windows rattled violently. A framed photograph of Granddad on the mantelpiece toppled over, shattering on the tile floor. "What was that?" Deborah cried, her voice trembling, her previous anger replaced by sudden fear. The lights flickered, plunged us into darkness for a heart-stopping moment and then flickered back on, dimmer than before. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling like a banshee, and the rain began to lash against the house in sheets, hammering against the windows with terrifying force. Heather rushed to the window, her hand pressed against the cool glass. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice laced with dread. "This isn't just a storm, look at the water." The usually calm turquoise sea had transformed into a churning, angry mass, dark and menacing. The waves were colossal, crashing against the shore with an alarming intensity, pushing further up the beach than I had ever seen. The rhythmic boom of the surf was now a relentless, ominous roar. "Everyone stay away from the windows," Janet commanded, her lawyer's composure momentarily giving way to a primal urgency. She was scanning the room, her eyes wide. And then, just as the gravity of the situation began to sink in, a terrifying sound ripped through the air, a deafening crack followed by a splintering crash. The enormous ancient palm tree just outside the living room window, a landmark that had stood for generations, groaned and slowly, agonizingly began to fall, its fronds whipping wildly in the wind. Its trunk hit the roof with a sickening thud that shook the entire house, sending dust and small debris raining down from the ceiling. A section of the roof above the kitchen crumpled inwards with another horrifying sound of tearing wood and shattering tiles. Panic erupted. Deborah screamed, a high piercing sound. Mr. Henderson, pale as a ghost, fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. Heather was trying to usher us towards the sturdy interior hallway. The storm surge, Heather gasped, her face ashen, pointing a trembling finger towards the beach. It's coming, we need to get out. Now. Through the deluge of rain, I could see it, a wall of dark water, a monstrous wave impossibly high bearing down on the house. The ground vibrated, a deep unsettling hum that resonated in my bones. The house, Granddad's beloved beach house, suddenly felt terrifyingly vulnerable, a fragile shell in the path of an unstoppable force. The thought of the will of Anya Petrova, of all the family drama, instantly vanished, replaced by one overwhelming primal instinct: survival. But as the first colossal wave slammed into the house with a force that made the very foundations shudder, sending spray and shattered glass flying, I knew we weren't getting out easily. The water was already swirling around our ankles, creeping rapidly up the floor. We were trapped. And Granddad's final, puzzling act, this bizarre will, suddenly seemed like a cruel joke in the face of what was about to descend upon us. My mind raced, not about money, but about the fragile lives in this collapsing house, and the profound, immediate, and utterly terrifying question of how on earth we were going to survive the night. The colossal wave slammed into the house with a force that made the very foundations shudder, sending spray and shattered glass flying. The water, a dark, churning torrent, was instantly at our knees, then our waists, powerful currents tugging at our legs. The air was thick with the scent of salt, damp plaster, and raw terror. Deborah screamed again, a sound ripped from her gut as she stumbled, nearly pulled under by the surge. I instinctively lunged, grabbing her arm, my grip tight as I hauled her back upright. Mr. Henderson, shrieking, was scrambling onto Granddad's antique armchair, trying to lift his briefcase clear of the rising tide. Heather, her face grim, was already moving, directing us with an urgent wave of her hand toward the back of the house, away from the collapsing front. The pantry, it's reinforced, she yelled over the roar of the wind and water, her voice surprisingly strong. And the old cellar access in the back hall, quick everyone. Janet, her earlier composure shattered, was surprisingly agile, kicking off her sodden shoes and wading through the water. Louis, help me with Mr. Henderson, she called, already pulling the lawyer, who was surprisingly heavy, off his precarious perch. Together we half-carried, half-dragged the blubbering man through the swirling water, debris swirling around our legs. The ceiling groaned above us and another crack echoed as more plaster rained down. Granddad's beloved home, the setting of so many joyful memories, was dissolving around us. Just as we neared the narrow hallway leading to the pantry, a shape emerged from the shadows. Ethan. He stood there, dripping wet, his face grim but focused, holding a thick nautical rope in his hands. He hadn't retreated, he had been preparing. Through here, Ethan barked, his voice deep and resonant even amidst the chaos. He pointed to a heavy wooden door that I knew led to a small, seldom-used storage room, barely more than a reinforced closet. It's small but solid, used to be a hurricane shelter for Granddad's supplies. He was already yanking the door open, revealing a dark, cramped space. Louis, Janet, help Heather and Deborah get in. I'll make sure the door holds. Heather pushed Deborah ahead, who was sobbing uncontrollably now. Come on, dear, we'll be safe in here. Her calm, even tone was a lifeline in the swirling chaos. Janet shoved Mr. Henderson in, then climbed in herself, her face pale but her eyes determined. I followed, squeezing into the tight space. Ethan, after a quick, assessing glance at the crumbling house, wrenched the heavy door shut and secured it with a series of sturdy bolts, the click of the locks barely audible over the intensifying deluge outside. The small room plunged into near darkness, the only light filtering through a tiny, grimy vent near the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and something metallic. Roar of the storm was muffled but still terrifyingly present, each crash against the house a physical blow that vibrated through the floor. We huddled together, soaked, shivering, and utterly helpless. Deborah was openly weeping into Heather's shoulder. Mr. Henderson sat slumped in a corner, murmuring incoherently about his insurance. Are we going to be okay? Deborah whispered, her voice cracking. Heather, despite her own fear, stroked Deborah's wet hair. We're together, dear. We'll get through this. Her eyes met mine in the dim light, a shared understanding of the profound danger we were in and the desperate hope for survival. Ethan, surprisingly, was the most composed. He moved with a quiet efficiency, checking the door, pressing his ear to the wall. He seemed to know the house better than any of us, sensing its vulnerabilities. It was a revelation, this side of him. The quiet loner, the oddball, was now our unexpected anchor. Hours blurred into an eternity. The sounds of the storm were apocalyptic. The shriek of the wind, the endless crash of waves, the sickening groan of the house. We felt the structure shift, heard things splintering, tearing away. At one point, the entire room tilted precariously and we all cried out, bracing ourselves for the end. But the small shelter held. When the world outside finally began to quiet, the silence was almost more deafening than the storm's fury. The rain had subsided to a drizzle, the wind a mere whisper compared to its earlier roar. Ethan was the first to move, unbolting the heavy door with a creak. He peered out, then motioned us forward. The house was a wreck. Water still stood several feet deep in the living room, a muddy, debris-filled pool reflecting the faint, bruised light of dawn. Half the roof was gone, the ancient palm tree a splintered ruin across the kitchen. Furniture was overturned, Granddad's belongings scattered and destroyed. The familiar, comforting space was unrecognizable. It was utterly heartbreaking. Oh, Granddad, Deborah sobbed, looking at the devastation. It's a miracle this room held, Janet murmured, her eyes scanning the destruction, already in lawyer mode, assessing the damage. This is complete devastation. Heather stood silently, looking at the ruins of her brother's home, a single tear tracing a path down her weathered cheek. It was the first real show of vulnerability I'd seen from her, and it struck me hard. She truly loved him, loved this place. "We need to get to higher ground," Ethan said, his voice flat, "and see if anyone else is out there." It took most of the morning for emergency services to reach our isolated stretch of beach. The roads were impassable, blocked by fallen trees and floodwaters. We were eventually evacuated by boat, picked up by the Coast Guard, a sight that felt utterly surreal. As we were pulled away, looking back at the mangled remains of the beach house, my grandfather's final puzzle, the bizarre will, seemed even more absurd. Who would want this now? This ruined shell of a home? Anya Petrova, whoever she was, would be inheriting a disaster. A week later, the initial shock had begun to wear off, replaced by a dull ache of loss and a growing sense of injustice. We were staying in a small motel further inland, salvaged belongings piled haphazardly around us. Mr. Henderson had returned north, promising to be in touch. The will was still set to be read, but the circumstances had changed everything. The storm had, in a twisted way, forced us to rely on each other, stripping away the pretenses and revealing the true character of everyone present. Heather, usually so reserved, had become a quiet pillar of strength. She had taken charge of logistics, ensuring we all had food, clothes, and a place to sleep. One evening, as we sat in the motel's cramped dining area, she looked at me with a rare intensity. "Louis, you were right, this will, it doesn't make sense. Arthur was a complex man, but he was always fair. He valued family above all else. There has to be something more, but what?" I asked, frustrated. Mr. Henderson was adamant he was of sound mind. Perhaps, Heather mused, but sometimes sound mind can be influenced by information or the lack thereof, or a skewed perspective. Arthur often saw things differently than others. She paused, then added almost to herself, he had a strong sense of justice too. Sometimes his actions, though seemingly erratic, were a way to right a past wrong. Her words hung in the air, hinting at depths I hadn't considered. Janet, surprisingly, had emerged as an unexpected ally. The storm had stripped away her professional aloofness, revealing a keen intellect and a surprising amount of empathy. She was still precise, but now her precision was focused on helping us. After the rescue, Shed immediately started making calls, researching legal precedents, and even offering to contact her own firm. "Look, Louis," Shed said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "I don't know your grandfather well, but this codicil is highly irregular, especially the charitable trust fallback. That often indicates a contingency, a lever. If this Anya Petrova doesn't take possession, a charity gets everything. It's not just about cutting you all out, it's about ensuring the house isn't simply sold off if she doesn't comply. It feels like a test or a message." She pulled out a legal pad already filled with notes. "I am willing to help you look into this. Pro bono. This just doesn't sit right with me." Her willingness to commit her professional time and reputation was a huge shift from the quiet, almost unapproachable woman I'd known. Her transformation was gradual but undeniable. The crisis had ignited a hidden fire in her. Deborah, too, had changed. The impulsive influencer was still there but muted. She had stopped posting frivolous content, her phone now used for more practical matters, checking news updates, finding available supplies, even helping Heather organize our temporary living situation. The fear in her eyes after the storm had been real, and it had grounded her. She was quieter, more thoughtful. One afternoon, she looked up from her phone, her blonde hair still tangled from the ordeal. "You know," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "Granddad always said the house was more than just a house. He said it held secrets. Maybe this Anya person isn't just some random stranger. Maybe there's a reason." Even Ethan, the perpetual loner, had become less of an enigma. He'd helped us secure what was left of the house, offering practical advice and unexpectedly a quiet presence that was calming. He didn't offer emotional support, but his reliable strength was a comfort. I saw him one morning looking out at the distant ocean, a profound sadness in his eyes. I approached him tentatively. "Ethan," I began, "thank you for the shelter, for everything." He grunted, but then surprisingly he spoke. "Arthur was a good man," he said, his voice rough. "Knew the sea. Knew people. Sometimes people needed to be pushed to see things." He looked at me, a hint of something unreadable in his gaze. He knew a lot more than he let on, about everything. It was a cryptic statement, but it hinted at a deeper connection between him and Granddad than any of us had realized. He had clearly known something more about Granddad's complex character. My own perception of him had completely shifted. He wasn't just an oddball, he was a keeper of unspoken truths, a silent witness to Granddad's deeper life. Our shared near-death experience, coupled with the continued mystery of the will, had forged an unlikely alliance. We were no longer squabbling relatives, but a team united by a common goal, uncovering the truth behind Granddad's final, baffling act. A month had passed since the storm, and the world was slowly, painstakingly putting itself back together. So were we. The will reading had been postponed, but a new date was set. Janet, leveraging her firm's resources, had begun a deep dive into Arthur's financial records and obscure family trees. Shed found nothing about Anya Petrova. No records of a distant cousin, no contact information, nothing. It was as if the name had been plucked from thin air. "It's highly unusual, Louis," Janet had reported, her brow furrowed. "Normally there would be some paper trail, a past communication, anything. This Anya Petrova is a ghost." I too had been busy. Fueled by Heather's insights and Janet's determination, I had taken on the role of lead investigator. My determined advocate trait was now fully engaged. I talked to Granddad's old friends, his neighbors, those who weren't like Ethan anyway, trying to piece together anything that might explain the will. I revisited the remains of the beach house, sifting through the mud and debris, hoping to find some clue that the storm hadn't washed away. The house, Granddad's ultimate legacy, had become a ruin, making the inheritance even more of a cruel joke. One afternoon, while sifting through the waterlogged contents of Granddad's old study, miraculously preserved behind a partially standing wall, I found it. Not a will, not a codicil, but a small, worn leather-bound journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It was Granddad's handwriting, neat and precise but filled with a profound weariness. I carefully opened it, the pages damp and brittle. The journal revealed a story far more complex than any of us could have imagined. It detailed Granddad's decades-long search for his younger sister, Anya, who had been separated from the family during the chaos of World War II and presumed dead. His guilt, his relentless search, his quiet hope, it was all laid bare. The journal spoke of a recent, tentative connection, a faint lead to a woman named Anya Petrova, living in Eastern Europe, a name he'd found through a complex genealogy search that he'd undertaken in his last years. He had never met her, never confirmed her identity with absolute certainty, but something in his gut told him this was her. His entries became more frantic in the last few months. He spoke of his failing health, his fear that he wouldn't have time to properly confirm her identity or bring her home. He wrote about his deep desire to right the injustice of her lost childhood, to provide her with a legacy, a safe harbor, a connection to the family she never knew. The beach house, his most cherished possession, was meant to be her link to him, to us. The condition that she had to take full possession and residency within 30 days of the will's reading was his desperate attempt to force a reunion, to ensure she truly existed and would embrace her place in the family, or for the estate to revert to charity if she couldn't or wouldn't. He wanted the house to be claimed by family asterisk, whether it was her or, failing that, the world through charity, rather than allowing it to be easily contested or fought over by those he felt hadn't truly appreciated its meaning. He'd seen the brewing greed in some distant relatives and he was trying to prevent it. He wanted to force a connection, a healing, or ensure it did some good if that failed. My stomach dropped as I read the final entries. Granddad hadn't meant to cut us out. He had believed he was including a lost piece of us, and if she couldn't be found or wouldn't claim her place, the trust would prevent a greedy free-for-all. He was trying to protect the house, his legacy, from those who would merely see it as an asset, not a memory. His last act wasn't a betrayal. It was a desperate, hopeful, incredibly complex gesture of love and atonement. And in his quiet way, he was also testing us, implicitly challenging us to understand his true intentions, to rise above simple greed. I brought the journal back to the motel, my hands shaking. I called everyone together, my voice tight with emotion as I recounted what I'd found. As I read passages aloud, the room was silent. He thought she was his sister, Heather whispered, tears in her eyes. My Aunt Anya, I remember my mother speaking of her, but we were told she died in the war. Arthur. He never gave up, did he? Her stoicism had crumbled, revealing the profound grief and a new understanding of her brother's deepest pain. So it wasn't about cutting us out, Deborah murmured, her voice soft. It was about bringing someone in, someone he thought needed it more. Her impulsiveness was replaced by genuine introspection. Janet, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking, this changes everything. This journal is evidence of his intent, his good faith, and his reasoning. It gives us a basis to contact this Anya Petrova with real context. It shifts the narrative from a perceived slight to a heartfelt search. Ethan, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. He talked about her sometimes, he said, his eyes distant, said he wouldn't rest until he found her, said she deserved a place to call home. He was a good man, Arthur, a complicated man, but good. His earlier reticence had given way to a quiet affirmation, a validation of Granddad's character that only he, the seemingly aloof neighbor, could offer. My own shame flared. I had judged Granddad so harshly, believing him to be manipulative or malicious, but he had simply been deeply wounded and trying to heal an old, festering family wound. I realized my own determined advocate nature, while well-intentioned, had made me quick to anger, quick to assume the worst. I had been so focused on the apparent injustice to asterisk us that I hadn't considered the deeper, more profound justice he was seeking. The storm had forced me to rely on others, to see their true characters, and the journal had forced me to confront my own flawed assumptions. The new will reading a few weeks later was a vastly different affair. Mr. Henderson, still somewhat flustered, presented the original will. Then Janet, with the journal clutched in her hand, calmly stepped forward. She laid out our findings, the story of Anya, Arthur's relentless search, and his desperate final act of love and hope. We also presented our decision. We would work together to find Anya Petrova, to confirm her identity, and to explain Granddad's wishes. We weren't contesting the will, we were fulfilling its true purpose. The journey to find Anya Petrova was long and arduous. It involved international agencies, genealogy experts, and a lot of dead ends, but we worked together. Janet used her legal network, Deborah leveraged her online skills, surprisingly effective for tracking down obscure leads, Heather provided her quiet wisdom and historical family context, and Ethan, through his unexpected network of retired sailors and expats, even provided a crucial off-the-grid contact that led to a breakthrough. Many months later, we stood in a small, modest apartment in a bustling Eastern European city. Anya Petrova, a woman in her late 70s, frail but with eyes that held an uncanny resemblance to Granddad's, sat across from us. She remembered fragments of her past, of a family, a young brother, a journey she could not fully recall. Heather spoke to her in soft tones, sharing old family stories, showing her photographs. I explained Granddad's journal, his lifelong search, his love. It was a delicate, emotional process. Anya Petrova didn't want the ruined beach house. She was old, rooted in her quiet life. The thought of managing such a property was overwhelming. But what she did want, with a quiet desperation, was family. She wept as Heather embraced her, as Deborah showed her old photos on her phone, as Janet spoke to her with genuine warmth, explaining the legal details of how the trust, now managed by Janet's firm with our oversight, could provide for her care and support for the rest of her life. A comfort and security she'd never known. The condition of taking possession, though literally impossible given the hurricane, was symbolically fulfilled by her acceptance of our family and Granddad's love. The beach house was eventually deemed a total loss and the land was sold. The proceeds, along with the bulk of the trust fund, were used to establish a new charitable foundation in Granddad's name, dedicated to helping displaced families and funding genealogical research to reunite lost relatives, a true reflection of his life's quiet passion. Anya received a generous annuity from the trust, allowing her to live her remaining years in comfort, surrounded by the newfound family who visited her regularly. We were no longer united by a crumbling house or a contentious will, but by a deeper understanding of love, loss, and the unexpected ways family can find its way back to itself. The dispute had, in a strange twist of fate, brought us closer than any mere inheritance ever could have. I still walked the beaches, no longer the Florida Keys but quieter shores, and reflected on the lessons learned. Granddad's will, initially a source of anger and confusion, had become his final, profound lesson. It hadn't been about the house or the money. It had been about connection, about the enduring power of family, and about the unexpected ways truth can emerge from the ruins of both physical structures and long-held assumptions. The tide had turned indeed, washing away our grievances and revealing a deeper, more resilient foundation beneath. We had not just survived the storm, we had learned to navigate its aftermath together, forever changed and irrevocably bound by Granddad's final, baffling, and ultimately brilliant act of love.